Hello everyone, welcome to ClearIAS. Today we have come up with another theme based on ancient Indian history, which is very relevant from both civil services preliminary and mains examination. Today we are going to talk about Vedic period. For this lecture, we are going to confine ourselves to early Vedic period. Now, before we begin this lecture, I would like to tell you that for a better viewing experience, you can increase the speed of this lecture, of this video, to 1.5. So let us begin. So when we speak of Vedic period, it is very important to know why is this period important historically. Now, if we talk about religion, then certainly Vedic period is very important because Vedas, they have been of significant importance in Hinduism. But what about historical perspective? This period is very important from the point of historicity because it is also known as the period of cultural transition. It is called as period of cultural transition because as we saw in the last lecture that the Harappan civilization with regard to Harappan civilization, we did not really have a lot of sources, especially the literary sources, which could tell us about its society and polity. But with regard to the Vedic period, or specifically with regard to the early Vedic period, we have the textual sources, the textual traditions, the literary traditions, which tell us about the society and polity of this particular time period. Now, when we speak of the textual traditions, or for that matter, the literary traditions, it is important to know that there is also a problem with this particular time period. The time period is broadly classified, the time period is broadly kept from 2000 BC to 600 BC. And if any of you does not really know about the concept of BCE and CE, please you can just write it down in the comment section. We can also prepare another video on the very concept of periodization. So when we speak of this particular period, 2000 BCE to 600 BCE, it is very important that we understand that a lot of our information is based on the texts than archaeology. For example, in the Harappan civilization, a lot of our knowledge about the civilization, if you look at the previous lecture that we had, it was based on archaeology. For example, Alexander Cunningham, he went on to delve into the findings at Harappa, but he did not really find a lot about it. And then we had various other archaeologists who further explored the site. But with regard to the Vedic period, we have mainly the textual sources. Now, this is again an issue because history has to be balanced with both textual and archaeological sources. It cannot simply rely on texts and it cannot simply rely on archaeology. For example, the texts that were written, or for that matter, the texts that were memorized, for example, the Vedas, they were certainly written by the seers, but at the same time, they were not written from the point of historicity. They were not written as historical sources. So this is one of the main issues. So because the writers they had their own conjectures about the way in which the world functioned around them. So a lot of personal inputs were also there. So it again kind of has its own set of concerns with regard to historicity of this period. But again, it was a watershed moment in history because we had textual sources which could give us a very good insight about the past. Now, so this particular time period, it can be broadly concluded that it was mainly the historical evidence for this particular time period is mainly based on the textual sources. So there has been a little bit of a conflict between texts and archaeology when it comes to writing of history. Now, when we speak of the early Vedic period, what is early Vedic period? Or for that matter, what is later Vedic period? Or for that matter, why is it that the Vedic period, the entire Vedic period has been classified into these two realms, the early Vedic period and the later Vedic period? So for this, we have to understand one thing that if you notice very carefully, so the very title of this presentation, it has a specific dating associated with it, which is 1500 to 1000 BC. And now as we move further to our first slide, it has another dating which is 2000 BCE to 600 BCE. And now we again have more datings. So what is the exact dating of the Vedic corpus? First of all, in order to be able to conclude about the early Vedic or later Vedic periods, we have to have a common ground on the Vedic period, the dating associated with Vedic period. So broadly, it has often been argued by some of the historians that some of the scholars have said that it is 1200 to 1000 BCE that the Vedas were written. Some of these scholars have argued that it is 1500 BCE to 1000 BCE that the Vedas were composed. And especially when we speak about the Vedas, these dates have been associated with the earlier sections of the composition of the Rig Veda. But it has also been argued that some of the portions may have been composed before 2000 BC. However, there is also a limitation to this because we cannot really push the dates more further because of various other reasons. Because we also have to place Harappan Civilization somewhere. So, and there are other historical issues as well. So, if we talk about dating, then 1200 to 1000 BC, Max Muller came up with this idea that the Vedas, but these were only provisional dates that he assigned to the earlier sections of Rigved. And he said that, okay, let us assign 1200 to 1000 BC to Rigved. Now, why is it that he assigned that? If it is rather interesting to know how he came up with these dates. So he said that the Vedant and the Sutra literature, it was contemporary to Buddhism, so it must have been around 600 BC. And similarly, he also said that, there were a couple of more texts which he assigned to 200 years prior to the Vedanta and Sutra texts. So it went on to go back to 800 BC. Now he had to place the Brahmanas. Brahmanas were another set of texts which were associated with the Vedic corpus, and he went on to assign 1000 BC to 800 BC to the Brahmanas. And now he was left with 1200 to 1000 BC because he thought that the earliest compositions must have ranged broadly within the time span of 200 years. So he assigned 1200 BCE to 1000 BCE to the earliest sections of the Rig Veda. But again, there have been certain scholars who have raised their own arguments about these datings, and some of these scholars have dated Rigved, the earliest compositions, from 1500 BCE to 1000 BC. And for example, Winternitz is there. He says that it should definitely be more than 1200 BC that these datings should be pushed to. And similarly, we have Jacobi, who goes on to assign the dates which conform to 3rd millennia BC. He says that the Rig Vedas could have been composed in the 3rd millennia BCE. And similarly, there have been various astronomical evidence that have also been used with regard to dating. And it has also been argued by modern scholars now, like Subhash Kak. You can search for him. He argues that Vedas may have been composed around 300 or 4000 BC. But broadly scholars have concurred that the earlier sections may have been composed around 2000 BC, but broadly Vedas, the Rig Veda is placed between 1500 to 1000 BC. Now, when we say the earlier sections of Rigved, what are the earlier sections of Rigved? And what are the later sections that were added to it? And besides Rigved, which ones were the other sections which were associated with the later Vedic period? So, when we speak of the early Vedic period, we normally uh, we imply that the early Vedic period is associated with the period in which the earliest sections of the Rig Veda were composed. And the earliest sections of the Rig Veda were uh, from book 2 to 7. Now, Rig Veda has 10 books, and these 10 books are called 10 mandalas. Mandala means circle. We call it Saur Mandal, right? So these mandalas, they have a whole lot of issues that they concern with. So the 10 mandalas, out of 10 mandalas, books 2 to 7 are the oldest. And these are also called family books because they have been attributed to certain sages and their families. For example, the families took up the names of these sages. So that is why these are called the family books. Whereas book 1, book 8, book 9, and book 10, these were composed later. Later means later than the ones that were composed in the early Vedic period, that were books 2 to 7. Now, when we speak of the early Vedic period, we have already discussed about dating, and now it is time to discuss about location. Why did we spend so much time about on dating, and why are we going to talk about location? Because if you talk about history, history is a subject that deals with time and space. So if you are going to read about a specific phenomenon in history, you have to attribute certain time to it, you have to attribute certain location to it, time and space. So we have already spoken about the issues that have dealt with the dating of the Rigvedic corpus, and now we have to talk about the location of the Rigvedic corpus or the spatial SPATIAL, spatial location of the Rigved. So if we speak about Rigved, then it is to be noted that uh, the early Rigvedic period, it was confined to eastern Afghanistan and Punjab, the land of Sapt Sindhu or seven rivers. Now, when we speak of the Rigvedic period, it has to be mentioned that when we speak of the history of the subcontinent or history of India, certainly Rig Veda, it presents us one of the first literary traditions from the subcontinent or for that matter from the world, but it cannot be called as the history of the world. It can only speak about the social and political norms that existed around its composition and in the region that it was composed in. So it was mainly confined to the early Rigvedic period. It was mainly confined to eastern Afghanistan and Punjab, and the region in Punjab, especially the land of Sub Sindhu rivers or the land of seven rivers. Now, which are these seven rivers? These seven rivers are the Indus, the five tributaries of Indus, and the Saraswati, which is often identified with modern Ghaggar Hakra River. And if we speak about the later Rigvedic period, we see that there was a certain kind of proliferation in the spatial domination of the Rigvedic period. for that matter, Kuru Panchal, which comprised the Indo-Gangetic Divide and the Upper Ganga Valley, they came under the influence of Vedic culture in the later Vedic period. In the next slide, we'll see that. So these were the spatial uh, aspects related to the early Rigvedic period. So, as we have seen, that time and space they play a very important part in making of any history. So here we can see that yes, we have this entire region which is associated with the early Rigvedic period, and especially in the early Rigvedic period, it was mainly uh, confined to this particular region, but it was only eventually that it came down to it came down to other regions as well in the mainland. Now we have spoken about the location of Rigved, we have spoken about the time of Rigved. Now, what about the society of Rigved and what did society comprised of? Now, when we speak of Rigved, it has a lot of issues again from the point of historicity. For example, it provides us a very rich source of knowledge about history, but at the same time, the people who have composed Rigved, at some point it has also been called as Aparushaya. Aparushaya means which has not been written by humans. It has been written with the help of divine intervention. I think, to the best of my knowledge, it was in Mimamsa tradition that Rigved was first called Aparushaya. Now, when we speak of the time and location of the Rigved, time and space, it is also important to talk about what kind of people comprised Rigvedic society. Now, when we speak of Rigvedic society, we mean early Vedic society, and especially with reference to Rigved, again, those 2 to 7 books that were composed in the early Vedic period. So, when it was a time for early Vedic period, what kind of societies existed then? So, with regard to societies, a very important concept has been there in history, which is the concept related to the existence of the Aryas. Now, this Arya, the concept of Arya, it not only has historical connotations, but it also has had political implications. Why has it had political implications? Because if you notice carefully, when the colonial masters they were kind of they were subjugating the colonies, there was a there was an overarching tendency of the colonial masters to exhibit a sense of white man's burden, that the colonies, the indigenous people of the colonies, they were extremely uncivilized, and it was the duty of the white man, quote unquote, to bear the burden of the colonies, of the people who had not been civilized. And when the nationalist response it came to when the nationalist response was given to the colonial masters, that no, we also had a very rich sense of history, we also had a very rich sense of civilization, then this concept of Arya race it was introduced, and it was called a race, not a section of people who had a different culture. Now, the this Aryan race it was associated a, with Indo-European people, and these Indo-European people, by this particular concept of race, the Britishers wanted the colonies and especially the Indian subcontinent to feel that maybe we were always inferior, but there was certain kind of a race which had already migrated to the Indian subcontinent, and that is why we have a little bit of a sense of civilization. So this was the broader idea that they wanted to project. And now when we speak of the Aryan race, can we call it a race actually? Because maybe there were, because obviously we can say that there were migrations happening constantly, because we saw that there was a lot of trade that was happening in the Harappan civilization, and there were constant migrations in different waves from the, as we see, from the northwest frontiers. From these portions, there were constant migrations, but if we would like to call them race, we can. A lot of scholars have gotten away with these notions. They say that maybe these migrants, they may have different culture, but we cannot entirely call them a different race. For example, they may have had a different language as well, but we cannot really call them a race. It is just like, for example, Romila Thapa argues that it is just like saying that all the English speaking people or all the Hindi speaking people in India, they belong to different races. So these are certain issues, these are certain counter arguments that have been given to the concept of the Aryan race. So it was not a different race, but maybe there were people who were constantly migrating from different cultures. And there have also been accusations that that the Aryan race, it inflicted certain kind of an invasion on the indigenous people. But as we will see, there was no invasion. We do not really find the evidence of any kind of an invasion, and it was not something very hostile. And certainly they had a superior military technology, but these things have been more or less a part of an assimilation. There may have been migrants which have constantly marked the influx in the Indian subcontinent. They may have had superior military technology for a very simple reason that they had access to horses, and also they were, I mean, they may have been introduced to the technology of copper smelting. But at the same time, it is not right to say that there was an outright invasion. And also another important concept here we would like to know that we would like to study about is Varna. So a lot of people who have spoken about Aryan race, they have also pointed out a word called Varna from the Rigved. So now Varna, it means color. Now, in Rigved, we often find this particular word which is often associated with complexion. So it has been inferred in ways in the ways which says that the indigenous people, I mean, it has been inferred in the ways that have been read as, for example, the indigenous people were of darker complexion, and the migrants, I mean, there is no word like migrants in Rigved, but or for that matter, the different cultures, I mean, the new cultures, they were of lighter complexion. And there are also other words like das or dasyu for which have also been understood as enslavement of the indigenous people. And there have also been different words like anas. For example, anas. Anas means somebody with flat nose. So it has been understood that maybe these migrant groups, they may have been they may have had sharper nose, Indo-European features, and the indigenous people, uh, they may have had different features. So there may have been some kind of a hostility. But it is also not true because these words have also been understood in a variety of different ways. And not only this, we also come across different kinds of evidence for the assimilation, cultural assimilation, that yes, the migrants, they were also introduced to a lot of local cultures. And not only that, they kind of assimilated a lot of cultures, local cultures into them. So we have we have read that the early Vedic culture, it can be it can be ascribed to the family of books of the Rigvedic Samhita. Now, what is Samhita? Samhita can be called as corpus of a text, and it has a whole different parts to it. But the books 1, 8, 9, and 10 of Rigvedic Samhita belong to the later Vedic culture, and the books 2 to 7, they belong to the early Vedic culture. Now, when we speak of Samhitas, we also have Samhitas of Sama, Yajur, and Atharva Vedas, and the Brahmanas, the Aranyakas, and the Upanishads attached to all the four Vedas. But we have to understand that these literary traditions, they have to be they come in the later Vedic cultures, about which we'll learn in in next lecture. Now, when we speak of the Rigvedic period, the early Rigvedic period, we have to understand one thing, that there was a certain cultural backdrop to these Rigvedic societies. Now, what kind of societies were these? We have to understand this in order to be able to understand the society and polity and economy. So, these societies were mainly tribal in nature. A lot of anthropologists, they have refrained from using the word tribe for these cultures, but broadly they have been called as tribal associations. Now, out of so many tribes that that existed in the early Rigvedic period, the five prominent tribes have been the Yadu, the Turvasha, Puru, Anu, and Druhyu, and these are collectively called as the five peoples, or Panchjana, or Panch Kristhia, or Panch Manusha. Purus and Bharatas are dominant tribes. So, out of so many tribes, there were certain dominant tribes which had more access to more access to economy. And what kind of economy we'll learn later. So Purus and Bharatas were the dominant tribes. They were more advanced in terms of their property, in terms of the technology that they were using. And Das and Dasyus, these have been understood as, just like we learned, the pre-Vedic cultures or gradual assimilation. How do we call it gradual assimilation, like we discussed in the last slide? So the non-Indo-Aryan names like Chumri, Dhuni, Pipru, and Shambhara, these have been found in the Rigvedic corpus. So we know that there was constant interaction between the Vedic people and the non-Vedic people. And one of the major events of the early Vedic period is the Battle of Ten Kings near River Ravi. And River Ravi, the ancient name for it is Parushani. Uh, it is a very important term actually. You can note it down. So when we speak of Ravi, it is significant. Parushini, it is significant in ancient and in history because the Battle of Ten Kings was fought near it. So we have to understand another thing about the early Rigvedic period, that there were constant battles, and to call a battle as an invasion, it would not be very justified. For example, some of the scholars that we discussed, they termed as something called an Aryan invasion. So it would not be very appropriate to call something like that as an invasion, because these were always inter-tribal conflicts, and these tribes were always engaged in battles, and there were battles specifically about the properties of each other that belong to each other. And what kind of properties we'll learn in economy section of this particular lecture. But these were the tribes which were constantly engaged in battles. Now, when we speak of polity, it is important to note that the Rigvedic polity was mainly monarchical form of government. When we speak of monarchical form of government, means it had a king, and when we I mean, there was a king, but of course, if there was a king, there would be a whole lot of machinery around him. So there were the this kind of machinery. It was complemented with different kinds of institution. For example, one of the salient features of these institutions was patriarchal families. How do we know that these were patriarchal families? From the names of the sages that have been found in Rigved. And now the different institutions, as far as the different institutions are concerned of this polity, we learn that the Jana, it was the largest social unit in Rigvedic times, and the lowest being Kula. Now Jana was the tribe and Kula was the family. So family was the structural and functional unit of the Jana, of the tribe. Kula was the structural and functional unit of the Jana. Now, social grouping was mainly in terms of Kula, as we have learned. Kula means family, and Kula eventually formed Gram and into Vishu and Jana. So the tribal assemblies were also called Sabhas and Samitis. So we'll learn about Sabhas and Samitis in some time, but these were the institutions that mainly decided the administrative, social, and political norms of the Rigvedic times. And sabhas were limited to few people, and samitis included more number of people. And I would like to tell you that you can easily learn this thing, as I mean, because it might just be a little confusing. So sabhas has sabha, sabha, so it has only 5 letters. So it would constitute limited number of people. And Samiti, Samiti, it has 6 letters in it. So it has more letters means more people. And Sabha, it has less letters means less number of people. I mean, it is just a mnemonic that I'm giving you in order to memorize it really well, because it is a very important concept with regard to Rigvedic period. So Sabha, if it had less number of people, so it is very obvious that it would have selected less, but selected few. Samiti, it had more, but not necessarily the selected few. So Sabhas had the main functionaries of the government, of the administration, and not the modern concept of the government, the republics, but of course the tribal settings of the governance. And we also learned that there was no proper arrangement of taxation. So we realized that the polity of Rigved, it was evolving. It did not evolve all of a sudden, but it was only developing gradually. Now, when we speak of economy that we have been talking about, that there have been several battles that have been fought amongst the tribes. So, what were these battles about? What was the main purpose of these battles? So, it was mainly land and cows, land and cattle. So we have different concepts like Gavishti, Gaveshana, Gohu, and Gavya. These suggest pastoral nature of the Rigvedic polity, because they all come from the root word of Gau. And we also have words like Godhuli and Samgava, which means dusk and morning. So we have uh, so the concept of cow, I mean, cow was so important to the period of Rigved, the early Rigvedic people, that the notions related to time were also counted. They were also calculated in terms of the ideas related to cow. Similarly, measures of area and distance included Gavyuti and Gocharman. So we learn that again, cow has been so important that Gavyuti and Gocharman, these two parameters are again associated with the main word go. And the daughter was called Duhitri. Duhitri is the one who milks the cow. Similarly, Gojit was the winner of cows. It was a word for a hero. A wealthy person was known as Gomat, the owner of cattle. And one of the epithets of the god Indra was Gopati, lord of the cattle. So Rigvedic people, they also had gods, and one of the epithets, titles of the Lord Indra was Gopati, the lord of cattle. And of course, there were the Rigvedic people, there were constant slaughters of a lot of animals. But again, Go has been also called as Agnya, which means that Rigved suggested that one should refrain from the slaughter of cow because cow was very, very important to economy. Now, agriculture was still evolving in Rigvedic times, and verbs like uap and krish were to sow and to cultivate respectively. Phala, langala, seer, these are the words for plow, and yeah, so these are the words for plow and phala, langala, and seer. These are the words for plow, and crafts mentioned include chariot making, cart making, carpentry, metalworking, tanning, making of bows and bowstrings, sewing, weaving, making of mats out of grass or reeds. Some of these occupations and crafts may have been the jobs of full-time specialists as well. And so we see that economy in Rigved it was evolving but was also very, very diverse. And we will also see how economy and society they were deeply interlinked. As we have seen that Rigvedic people they used to have cows. I mean, can be a very social aspect because a lot of intertribal wars they were fought for cows, but at the same time, cow was also very important. Cattle was also very important from the perspective of economy. And war booty was a major source of wealth. Whenever a tribe would attack another tribe, it would have war booty. It would have a lot of mementos for itself, and it was a major source of wealth. And one of the important feature of the Rigvedic period was the use of IS. Now, there has been no clear indication to what this IS could have been, but scholars have broadly argued that this could be associated with copper. The use of iron it is seen only towards the later Rigvedic period and especially towards the rise of the Janapadas that we see the use of iron. But iron was mainly used in the early Rigvedic period. Now, when we speak of society, so Rigvedic society is again a very interesting feature because Rigved has often been cited by the nationalist historians when India was still colonized. The nationalist historians they would often argue, and especially if I can remember the names. So it was, I think, Shakuntala and JB Chaudhary and Upadhyay, who have strongly argued, and Altekar as well, who have strongly argued that the women enjoyed a respectable position in Rigved. But a lot of scholars now, a lot of feminist scholars, they often question this concept because they often ask if women were able to make political decisions, if women were able to lead the families, if women were able to have the right on their own body and on the economy in terms of production, on on the political decisions. So certainly a lot of these questions are to be answered, but of course it is definitely to be understood that women were able to participate in political arena, in sabhas and samitis, and there were women poets as well, Apala, Lopamudra, Vishwavara and Ghosha. These were some prominent poets of the Rigved, poetess in the Rigved, and uh, it is to be understood that a lot of scholars they have raised different kinds of questions, especially with regard to deities as well, the female deities that we find in Rigved, but we'll talk about it in the next section. So cattle, especially cows, became very important, and women enjoyed respectable position in Rigved, and cattle became very important. Monogamy was practiced, but polygamy was observed among royalty and noble families, and there was no child marriage as we have see as we see in the Rigved, and social distinctions existed but were not very rigid and hereditary. Social distinctions, as in it was not necessary for a person to choose the vocation that was practiced within the family. For example, we have hymns in Rigved. By the way, there are 1,228 hymns in Rigved, and one hymn consists more than, I mean, one hymn consists several verses. So there are a lot of verses, but a group of verses, it was called a hymn, and there were about 1,028 hymns in Rigved. So it is quite intriguing actually. So the social distinctions existed, but not rigid and hereditary, because in one of the hymns of Rigved, we learn that the social distinctions that the mother was completely engaged in a different vocation, for the father was engaged in a very different occupation. Children were both engaged in very different kinds of job. Now, when we speak of society, it is very important to talk about religion. So we have instances of gods and well-defined gods this time. Since we did not really know a lot about the gods in the Harappan period, but this time we have a well-defined idea about gods. But again, in Rigved, we do not really find the references to temples, and simple uh, simple and plain. The concepts related to religion are very simple and plain, and they did not really incorporate a lot of ornated features and natural forces such as gods, natural features like Prithvi, Agni, Vayu, Varun, and Indra. These gods were associated. These were the gods, and they were associated with natural features of the nature. For example, earth was associated with Prithvi, fire was associated with Agni, Vayu was associated with wind, and Varun was associated with rain, and Indra was associated with thunder. Now we learn one more thing about from Rigved, that of course there were several gods, but again Rigved, it also, there are several hymns that also invoke a common god. For example, the supreme god. So there are instances of monotheism as well, which you find in Rigved. But as far as the anthropomorphic god is concerned, a god with human-like features, anthropomorphic god. Indra is one of the most important deities. Indra is, in fact, the most important deity in Rigved in these terms. And Indra was followed by Agni. Now, Indra was very popular for a very simple reason that Rigved was still practicing. I mean, it was evolving, and it was settled lifestyle that was It was a settled lifestyle that was practiced in Rigved, and agriculture was one of the key features of the economy of Rigved. So Indra was worshipped because Indra was the god of rain, thunder. So Rigvedic people, they were very dependent on rain. So thus Indra became very important. Agni was again very important, another important god besides Indra. Agni became important because Agni was considered as the mediator between the gods and the people. Whenever there would be a sacrifice, because these sacrifices were also gaining importance in Rigvedic period. So whenever there would be a sacrifice, it was mediated by Agni. You would be surprised. In fact, you should not be surprised to know that one of as the that the first verse in Rigved, it is it is dedicated to Agni. So the maximum number of references that we find in Rigved is that of Indra, and then we have Agni as the most important god. There are also references to gods like in the Vedic corpus. There are references to gods like Vishnu, and a lot of scholars have argued that those were not the prominent gods. But again, scholars like Sushil Kumar, they have argued that a god should not be, the significance of a deity should not be judged mainly on the basis of the number of references that we find in a text, because there could be more to it. Now, with respect to the female deities, we have Aditi and Ushas. Aditi was actually, she has been seen as the mother of she has been seen as the mother of Indra. And Usha, I think she was goddess of dawn. And you should know that a lot of scholars have argued that maybe there have been female deities definitely in the Rigvedic period, but they were not very important. But one cannot completely agree on that as well. For example, there have been hymns where whenever Indra has been represented in a way that whenever he would be going out for battles, he would be taking power from Aditi. So again, he is deriving his power from Aditi. So one has to take into consideration these aspects as well, and one cannot simply discard the importance of the female deities. Similarly, as we learned about women in Rigvedic society, there are also references where women were choosing their husbands in the festivals called summons. There were instances where women have been wanting that everybody in their family should fall asleep so that they can consort with their romantic companions. So, of course, women, they did have a lot of authority over their own body, over their sense of existence, sense of being, more importantly. So we have to take into these considerations as well. So this was what we learned today. And if there is any issue, if there is any problem with regard to this lecture, you can always write it down in the comment section. In the next lecture is going to be an equally important one. It was a very important theme that we covered today. In the next section, we are going to cover later Vedic period. In the next session, we are going to cover the UPSC questions related to prelims and mains with regard to the Vedic period. And in the next section, we are going to look at other sources of the Rigvedic period and other features of the Vedic period, and especially the later Vedic period. So stay tuned for these lectures on ancient Indian history. And for more videos like this, like, share, and subscribe to ClearIAS. And if you have any issue, please, if you have not understood any concept in this lecture, please just note it down in the comments. I would be more than happy to answer. And study well. Good care.